We are just so privileged to get Afua Hirsch with us. She's a kind of, I don't know, rock chick of the best kind of writing and storytelling, and central to so much. And I have to say that the person who really wanted you on was Alison Phillips, who absolutely loves your book and loves you. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison.
With all my heart. And I reread the book, and I think, again, it's just such an important book. Gets more important, really, as the months and years go by. So I just wanted to start, if you could tell us about the beginning of this journey that you've been on. I think quite an extraordinary journey, being mixed race, middle class, as you say, relatively comfortable life and so on. And yet there was something in you that needed a name, an identity, a place to belong. And I love that those that you quoted. You start with a quote, don't you, about a place to belong. Hang on. The ache for home lives in all of us, the safe place where we can go as we are and not be questioned. So do you want to talk us through that a little bit?
Sure, and it's actually quite relevant to my journey into journalism. I actually did an interview today with The Guardian, who are conducting a big oral archive project to record the testimonies of journalists who've worked at the paper over different periods in time. And it was causing me to reflect on how I became a journalist and the ways in which my identity and my experience, my perspective informed that. And I first started reporting when I was a teenager at The Voice newspaper, which is Britain's oldest Black newspaper. And there's a story I could tell about how I had this yearning for reporting and a kind of calling to be a journalist. But the truth is that I was, as you said, Yasmin, a mixed race girl growing up in an overwhelmingly white environment. I rarely saw other people who looked like me or had names like mine, even though actually Wimbledon, which is where I grew up, is only a couple of miles from some of the most diverse parts of London. But it was a very kind of white, affluent enclave. And I really was attracted to The Voice because it gave me access to the Black community. It gave me access to a community of Black professionals who actually were incredibly nurturing towards me as a young girl who had this passion for writing and reporting and asking questions and telling stories. And this is a bit sad, actually, but it also gave me a kind of device to access my peers, my Black peers. I didn't have Black friends because there were no Black kids at my school. We didn't live in an area where there were other families with similar heritage. So as a reporter, I went and sought out Black teenagers and interviewed them for stories I was writing. And so if I'm really honest, I think my loneliness as somebody who wasn't just mixed race or Black, it was that I was actually proud of my Blackness. I grew up with a Ghanaian mother who is incredibly secure in her identity, with a Ghanaian family, and anyone who knows Ghana knows that the part of Ghana my family's from is a matrilineal society. It's very female dominated. So I grew up with a very fierce clan of essentially matriarchal Ghanaian women. And that really gave me, which I'm very grateful for now, a solid foundation in my Blackness. But there was no space in which to express that, connect with it, celebrate it, interrogate it in my life. The only access I had to Blackness in my formal world was negative. Stories about racism, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, the depictions of Black people, which were overwhelmingly negative, the depictions of Africa, which were overwhelmingly negative. This was the 80s and 90s, so it was Live Aid, it was famine, it was dictatorship, it was war. And that single narrative of Africa that we still see in the media really affected me personally, because it was the only information I was getting about the continent that my heritage was from. So that identity crisis that I lived as a teenager is also the reason I became a journalist, and really motivated me and gave me the gift of journalism as a way of pursuing my intellectual curiosity and understanding more both about my Blackness and my sense of identity, but also to understand the narratives that were shaping those things as well, why there were these perceptions of the Black community as inherently criminal or delinquent, which was to an extreme extent the case in the 80s and 90s. It's still the case now, although often more subtle. So that was the turning point for me. And I started writing The Voice when I was 14. And I went on work experience and I wrote a piece, and I remember it very well, and I'm not proud of it. It was basically an article about Faith Evans cobbled together from different press releases. It was done on a day's work experience, but they could see that I could write and that I was really enthusiastic. And there was a section in The Voice called The Young Voices, which was, when I started, it was basically a kiddie page. It was like competitions, giveaways, puzzles. So I really took it over and turned it into a space for exploring the issues affecting young Black people. And they were the issues that were affecting me as a 14, 15-year-old girl: teenage pregnancy, body image.
Yeah, because you said in the book, and that bit really touched me when you said, you know, when you went to school, you had your natural hair, and they used to call you troll, and they used to say, somebody said you were, you know, they used to tease, actually they were horrible to you. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's mixed, because I mean, I described in the book the experiences that were most traumatic and that were quite abusive, but on the whole, it wasn't abusive. I was quite popular, and I think, and this is an issue that I feel strongly about. I think that we live in a class society. If you're a middle-class person, you try to assimilate into the class environment that you belong to. And the pressure is extreme, and your friends and your peers encourage you to assimilate, in the sense that my school friends said to me, and I wrote about this in the book, they said, "Don't worry, Af, we don't even see you as Black, you're fine." And those are the kind of well-intentioned messages that you get as a middle-class Black person, that the best outcome for you is to opt out of Blackness, to assimilate into whiteness, to totally erase your heritage and identity and try and become racially invisible, which you know won't succeed, because you're simultaneously living in a very racialized society. You see the disparity, you see the depictions of Black people in the media, you see the outcomes for Black people, whether it's employment, schools, housing, the entire society. So it's this very, it's kind of like a cognitive dissonance, that people are trying to persuade you that you should be deracialized whilst also racializing you. And that, I think, is a specific middle-class phenomenon, because there's this idea that you are progressing and achieving social mobility if you opt out of Blackness in Britain, and you get rewarded for it. And conversely, if you draw attention to your Blackness, if you own it, if you're vocal about it, that's seen as quite threatening and provocative. And this is something that I think my whole career bears out. That I
shall never forget that moment when I watched you on the pledge, and you were talking about racism. And once again, and you could see it in your face. You could read everything in your face. I've been doing this all my life. You're not listening to our testimonies. Yeah, you're just not giving credence to our experiences. To people you worked with on that program for quite a long time. It was a deeply poignant moment, and they didn't see it and they didn't get it. So it seems that this is a struggle that's never ending.
I think this is the really unique thing about being a journalist or commentator or writer who writes about race and identity, because in TV shows like The Pledge, for example, you're having, it's debate, it's designed for debate. And the model is that you have people with different views, you come around a table and you disagree. And when it's Brexit or British foreign policy, it's a debate that you can conduct in a way that's external to your humanity. But when the conversation turns to race, it's impossible to distribute the burden of that conversation equally around the table. So when we're having a conversation about race and there's gaslighting happening, there's the denial that race exists, where I'm being asked to persuade my colleagues that racism exists, that Black people are equal, then it's traumatizing, because you are performing the dynamic that you're critiquing all at the same time. And I found that very draining, because it's not an argument you're asking people to acknowledge intellectually. You're being asked to justify your humanity, your right to be at the table. And that that episode of The Pledge. I did so many, but the one you're referring to was actually a turning point for me, because I, until that point, had endured that experience on the basis that it's good to have a multiplicity of voices. I believe in free speech. I believe in a kind of marketplace of ideas where people make up their own minds. However, the ways in which those debates are being structured and marketed, I came to believe after that was actually not about a free marketplace of ideas. It was rigged, and it puts the Black person in an unfair position where they are being discriminated against in real time whilst having to argue against discrimination. And also that it's not a legitimate debate. It's not a conversation. It's helping to normalize racism. It's helping to legitimize the idea that you are unequal. So it's very, I think it's complicated, but I personally have become more selective about the spaces I enter and much more focused on spaces where I feel it is a genuine conversation rather than spaces that I think actually contribute to the problem. And I didn't want to send a message to people that that's acceptable, that at work or in your family or in any other social or professional sitting, it's okay to be that one person of color in a space where your humanity is being denied. And I think that from the reaction to that clip, which actually had about 5 million views, which really surprised me actually, so many people related to it and said, this is what happens to me at my in-laws dinner table. This is what happens to me in the tea room at work. And I think that it's in different ways something that many people can relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I could see it was a turning point. And I know that a lot of young Black women and young Asian women learned from you that you can say no. You know, I'm very old now and I've never felt that I could, but I learned from that, saying, you know what, I'm not your muppet to entertain you or to make you feel that you have to test yourself against me. So you really changed something, I think, with that. But now,
I also want to say that I am also influenced by a generation younger than me, because I'm actually not that young. I'm going to turn 40 this week. And
happy birthday.
Thank you. I have really been influenced by a younger and more unapologetic generation. And, you know, when I wrote my book, it really is hard to communicate now how nuclear it felt. It felt like a very radical thing to do, to even talk about race and to explore the fragility of whiteness in my personal experience and my professional life. It was something that I hadn't done. They're conversations that I hadn't even had with some members of my family, let alone my colleagues and peers. And I had no idea how it would be received. And I suspected it would be quite detrimental to my career, actually. But I did it anyway, because I felt it needed to be done. But, you know, 5-10 years younger than me, I see especially these young women who are totally unapologetic and really confident in owning their voice and the spaces they'll enter. And, you know, even saying that they can't debate with racists because it makes them dehydrated, you know, which is something that I never thought about, but it so does. So anyway, you know, it's a kind of virtuous circle where I think that our norms and values are shifting and we're able to influence and learn from each other. And there are so many older journalists that have really mentored, supported and encouraged me, but simultaneously I've mentored people who have taught me a lot about their completely no nonsense attitude as well.
Yeah, I know, it's brilliant. Oh, hello, Bikeke. Welcome. You're from Uganda, my old country. You're joining us. How wonderful is that? But one of the things that I want you to talk about Sam in a minute, but because it's very important, because there's something he did to you in terms of realizing, you mentioned the class divide, but also I think raised in you something quite important, which was that he came from great deprivation, the young Black man growing up in an inner city neighborhood with, you know, very little going for him in terms of access to the good things of life or even the essential things of life. And yet he is completely confident in his Blackness. And that you make that very powerfully clear. And there's something in you, I sense, that actually I felt, and this will interest our friends in Uganda. I was growing up in Uganda as a brown girl in a very racist community, because the way we were organized, the whites looked down on us and we looked down on the Blacks. That's how it was set up, right? And right from the time I was very young, I hated it. I hated being in this place. And you know, a lot of Asian women want to be white. They want to change the color of their skins. I wanted to be black. I so wanted to be black. I can't tell you, when I was at a meeting, the first ever African novelists conference at Makerere, which was my first university. And a headmaster took me, and I was the only brown child there, and there was one other chap called Rajat Nyogi. I just wanted to be black because I felt that they were more assertive, more confident, and they knew who they were. And when I was reading this book, I was just reminded of that feeling of, yeah, it's this strength that, you know, I didn't feel I had, and I've since acquired, thank God.
I think it's a really complicated thing, you know, and I relate to that as a mixed race person, because on the one hand, this is a very color prejudiced society, and you come to be aware of the privilege you attract by, in my case, being a lighter skinned mixed race woman, and that actually that proximity to whiteness is something that has opened doors for me, not necessarily through my conscious awareness at the time, but that's the way that race is structured. That's the way that privilege works, that people are more comfortable. You're the more accessible, less threatening face of people of color. And that's how it works. And you get privilege from that. And it's so important to acknowledge that, and to realize that any access or platform you get, I personally think the way you deal with that is by being very relentless in using the spaces that you get through that privilege to critique the privilege and also draw attention to it. But at the same time, it's hard to be, and so I say that because that's kind of the preface to any lamenting of the pain or the confusion or the identity crisis of being mixed race or light-skinned. But there is also a kind of psychological experience of not really feeling entitled to access blackness. In my case, you know, not having permission to fully be black, not being sure if I get to count as a proper black person, feeling illegitimate really among black people. And it's complicated in Britain because it's class and race, and blackness is associated with working class identities because black people have been propelled down the socioeconomic spectrum in Britain through systematic disadvantage, the way immigration has been conducted and the conditions on immigration in Britain. So when you're middle class, you're perceived as even more of an illegitimate black person. What kind of black person speaks like that? What kind of black person reads these kind of books? So when you're already confused and you're already trying to work out your identity, it's another layer of kind of confusion that you have to work through. And I think all these realities can exist together. The fact that you have this privilege that's unfair, and the fact that you also have this disadvantage in terms of the integrity of your identity because you're just not really sure what you are. And I felt I had to work quite hard to feel entitled to associate myself with the Black community. I felt like I had to earn that, you know, because I got all of these privileges of growing up in a white space, and I didn't seem fair for me to expect Black people to just welcome me with open arms when I hadn't had the same lived experience as most other Black people. And I also had benefited from my proximity to whiteness. And, you know, actually, that felt like such a niche and obscure experience when I wrote my book. I wasn't sure if anyone would get it and how it would be received. And it's one thing that's been fascinating is that the way it's connected me with other, not just mixed race people, but people of color, Black people, Asian people who live in predominantly white communities, because by definition, we're quite invisible. And actually, I discovered that basically every village in England has like one Black or brown person in it. And that one Black or brown person was reading my book and saying, that is my life. And so I kind of had this like, niche crowd of people who were coming to my events and saying, that is literally my life. And it was so cathartic for me because I always thought I was the only person who had that experience. And all the people I met also thought they were the only person. And of course, there are many. So many.
Do you want to read just a little excerpt from your lovely book?
Sure. I'm just going to read from the very beginning, since it's you mentioned that part of the story. So the first chapter, introduction, is called Identity Lessons. And I've quoted Claudia Rankine and this is a quote I often find myself turning back to. The world is wrong. You can't put the past behind you. It's buried in you. It's turned your flesh into its own cupboard. On a Friday evening in October 2004, with the nights drawing in and the layers piling up over summer clothes, I was sitting cross-legged in the living room of my friend Miranda's house in East London. I had recently returned from living in Senegal, one of the last frontiers of Africa before it stabs into the Atlantic Ocean to the west and melts into the Sahara Desert in the north. 2 years earlier, I'd barely had time to say goodbye to these university friends. I'd given myself a few days to recover from the exhaustion of my final exams, packed 2 large suitcases, then boarded an Air France flight. 21 years old, impatient to begin the journey into my new African identity. It was a journey that had been years in the planning. The friends gathered round on this autumn night had treated my return much as they had my departure, curious but unsurprised. I came bearing stories of unpredictable work in countries that most British people have barely heard of: Chad, Burkina Faso, Sao Tome, of trying to hold meetings with government ministers in languages I could barely speak, of only just surviving cerebral malaria, of smuggling suitcases of cash into war zones. My friends, deep in the hustle of London's graduate job market, pointed out how fortunate I was to be able to decorate my CV with this kind of experience. But that had never been the reason for going. I hadn't left Britain to become an expat with a competitive advantage in the job scrum. I had left Britain to leave being British. I believed that relocating my future to one or more of Africa's many nations would solve the problems of belonging that had nibbled away at me, a mixed race girl growing up in Britain, for as long as I could remember. I had not meant to come back, not after 2 years, not ever, but to settle in West Africa for good and take up my place in the world as a proud African, in places where I thought I would fit in. Exactly the opposite happened. Living in Senegal, I had discovered, to my endless confusion, how British I was. Returning to London meant the relief of familiarity, of home, but the painful reminder that home was a place that had surveyed me as alien, questioned me about my background, and expected me to provide explanations. Very little, it seemed, had changed. I was in love with a man I'd met not long before, Sam, who lived just a mile away from Miranda in Tottenham, a part of London he always described as the hood. This environment had shaped him into a person unlike any I had ever met before, and having returned to it from a northern university where he'd spent 3 years getting a law degree, he now clerked at a solicitor's firm during the day, saving up money before starting the vocational course to become a barrister. He spent each evening after work on the athletics track, and unlike any other 24-year-old I knew, Sam had his own car, source of independence for which he spent years working, and he was always on the move late at night, plugging away at the personal development books he credited him with sparing him the same fates as his friends. It never ceased to shock me how many of the people who grew up with were in jail or in and out of mental institutions or stuck in minimum wage jobs. And in his community, he seemed to know everyone. Since he was so close by, Sam offered to pick me up from Miranda's house and drove me home to Wimbledon, where I lived. Just before midnight, he rang the doorbell. The scene had already played itself out in my mind. I was excited about introducing my friends to this man they had heard so much about. I pictured him coming in, joining our little circle, sharing some tofu cheesecake. That, however, is not how it went down. Miranda opened the door. Sam said hello to her cautiously as he stepped through that front door and into the room with the big bay window and the cluttered piano. Once inside, he stopped dead, as if in shock, and stared. He shifted from foot to foot, mumbling hello, and gazed around in bewilderment, taking it all in. Sam, so confident, so uneasily fazed, was quiet and perplexed. In all his life, he told me later, he had never seen a scene like this. People talking so earnestly, almost conspiratorially, in low, hushed voices, even eating the way we were eating, an array of strange plant foods being passed around on little plates. You lot sitting there with your herbal tea all round in a circle. Nah, Sam shakes his head. That blew my mind. And I mean, I thought I'd seen it all. What's so strange about it, I ask. You don't understand. He shakes his head again. This area's hood, you know. People getting shot in the area, man them on the hustle. And you lot were sitting there all oblivious, all huddled around. In Wimbledon, yeah, fine. But in my area, you're still behaving the same way. I would never, in all these years growing up around here, have known that scene could exist in this area. There was something else that bothered Sam at the time. He had his own preconception about my group of friends. He knew we had been to Oxford and that many of us were privately educated, some at elite boarding schools. Now we had our degrees in the bag, we represented everything that he and his friends had never had access to, a kind of uniform privilege that, as far as he was concerned, meant that success for us was guaranteed with as much certainty as failure was for most of the people around him. Listen, in my brain, you lot went to Oxford. You're supposed to be the creme de la creme. You're supposed to be blitzing this life. And there you were sitting around so tentative, like so unsure of yourselves. Trust me, if a man like me had the opportunities you all had, there'd be no stopping me. We'd be up in this country making some serious money. We'd be running things instead of sitting around all quiet. Conversations with Sam still go like this.
This man, the mystery Sam, we've all been wanting to see forever. Thank you so much. I want to say the book is divided. I think it's really beautifully organized into so where are you from? The question, which I'd really like us to talk about next, the origins, the whole kind of body and physicality, heritage, and then the new black. So can we first talk about the question and then move to the new black and maybe talk about whether Black Lives Matter has really done something to the new black?
Yeah, so in terms of the question, I think I was trying to highlight, and I think it's a real theme of my book and my life experience, what some academics have called well-intentioned racism, or racism with a smiling face. And, when you're middle class in Britain, most of the ways in which you're racialized are not that overt. They're not openly hostile or violent, although that does happen. They're mostly forms of othering, microaggressions, just subtle ways of reminding you that your presence here is conditional and demands an explanation. And that manifested every single day in the question. And I call it the question rather than a question, because usually you meet someone, you go through various forms of social interaction, and then you ask each other questions. This question is one that I found myself being asked first before I'd open my mouth, before any introduction had been made. And the question is, where are you from? And it's something that it was almost demanded as a condition of further engagement. And again, it was often well-intentioned. It was asked with curiosity. But the reason I really single it out is that I know many white British people who have fascinating immigration histories, Celtic, Jewish, Mediterranean, Huguenot ancestry, Viking heritage that they've traced. And I have never seen a white British person be demanded to explain where they're from, even if they're a recent immigrant. They might get asked that when it is audible that they have a foreign accent, but that would require them to speak first. I've never seen a white person before they've opened their mouth be asked where they're from. And if you look non-white, you are asked this question because it's perceived that you just can't be British. And if you are British, you must be a recent immigrant. And there's different layers to that question. One, it's a kind of demand for facts, but two, and this is the real issue that I have with it, it is symptomatic of a deeper belief system. And I think many people subconsciously or consciously have this belief, and that is that British is essentially a white identity. Britishness is white, indigenous British people are white. And none of this is based on historical fact. It's all narrative, and mainly narrative that was actually created quite recently during the colonial era, and especially in the 19th century, to help justify the project of imperial conquest. So I think that people are performing their belief in the whiteness of Britishness when they single out non-white people and ask them where they're from. And that's why it was important to write about it. And it's been an important part of my life, because I talked about the pressure to assimilate if you're middle class in Britain, if you're Black or other ethnic minority. And one of the things that reminded me that I would never really be allowed to assimilate if I wanted to, which thankfully I don't think I ever really did. One of the things that alerted me to the faux nature of that offer was the question. And it showed me that actually people do perceive me through a very racialized lens. They notice that I'm not white and they want to know about it. And so this idea that you can just disappear your otherness is obviously false. And it also rests on very problematic ideology. But that was my access point, and as a child, all you know is people keep asking you where you're from, in the place that, as far as you're concerned, you're from. I mean, this is Wimbledon. That's really where I'm from. And I've never been asked that question as much anywhere in the world as I have in Wimbledon. So there you go.
Well, it's a question we all struggle with, and the other one that I find very hard, and I don't know if you get persistently told, instructed, is I should be more grateful to be here.
Gratitude, I think, is really complicated because I think it's also a generational thing. And I think that many of our antecedents, ancestors, parents, grandparents have actually internalized that narrative of gratitude because it was a very colonial idea. So my grandfather was son of cocoa farmers in a rural part of what's now Ghana. It was then the Gold Coast, was given a scholarship to Cambridge in the 1930s. And he was grateful. He had been socialized in a colony based on white supremacist ideas, where he was educated to believe that the closer you could get to whiteness and European education and civilization and Christianity, the more sophisticated, successful, wealthy, everything, civilized you would become. That was the way he was deliberately conditioned by his missionary and colonial education. So when he got the chance to go into the imperial motherland and receive that westernization, he was really grateful for it. And this isn't in any way to criticize my grandfather because he was a product of his conditioning, but he then passed on this idea that assimilating into whiteness or achieving Eurocentric education and values, religion, language was progress. That was the best thing that could happen to you. That's how empire worked. You couldn't control a quarter of the earth's surface through military force. You had to make people believe in their own inferiority. And that's what the British did. And that doesn't disappear when decolonization happens. That takes generations. That's mental colonization that persists. And so that gets handed down intergenerationally. So I think that many of us who have parents or grandparents born in the British Empire have in some way been taught that we should be grateful to be here because this is the imperial motherland. This is where everyone wanted. This is where everyone was educated as the best place to be. That we should aspire to be accepted or tolerated. And tolerance is literally the word we use to describe our values when it comes to people of different races and cultures being present. We say that we value tolerance, which is actually really offensive when you think about what it means. So gratitude is something that is kind of been hardwired into much of our conditioning and socialization. And I think for me, rejecting that gratitude narrative was a project. And it's then, once you reject it, it's very interesting to compare your own sense of identity with the ways in which people treat you. And it's frequent that people on the right, for example, in journalism in particular, accuse me of not being grateful enough to be in Britain. That one of the main responses to my book from the right was that I should be more grateful. I should be more grateful that I'm allowed to be here, and therefore I should not critique Britain, which, you know, I mean, there's many.
Well, I get that all the time. Even when the tweets came out about today's event, several of these guys were saying, you know, are they going to be grateful or are they going to carry on hating this country? But, you know, the first column I ever wrote in my life was one day in 1989. I was so furious when and I wasn't a journalist or anything, I'm not trained. When for the umpteenth time, people said, oh, you must be so grateful to be here away from that Idi Amin. And something exploded in my head. And I turned to him and I said, do you know why I'm here? It's because your country, Israel and the US, put Idi Amin into power without thinking what the consequences would be for Black Africans, Black Ugandans, and for people like us. Because you didn't like the elected president who was veering towards the Soviets. So why should I feel grateful to your country, which got me into this position, which led to my expulsion? And it was at a dinner party, and you don't do things like, as you know, a very fine dinner party. And that was my very first column in The Guardian, published that week.
1989, you've been doing the work, Yasmin.
Lots of little bits of history that some of them I didn't know. Maybe you can just share that. But after you've done that, I want you to just say, how do you keep so strong and brave in the face of all of this? But just the one I love is the Baden-Powell story. Can you just share that? Because the missing history, as David Olusoga says all the time, not knowing your history is part of the problem, not wanting to know the real history.
Yeah, so I grew up in Wimbledon, as I've said, and I grew up with the impression that Africa was over there. It was this kind of basket case. Luckily, I knew differently from my personal experience, but you know, you're very vulnerable to media and popular narratives when you're growing up in Britain. I'd never been to Ghana, and at that point in my life. So Africa was over there. It was riddled with all these problems because everything was wrong with it. It was the dark continent. It was hopeless. And Britain, and especially middle-class affluent Britain, places like Wimbledon, were the opposite, had no connection to Africa. And it was just so interesting to explore the square mile I grew up in and the extent to which in that very small space, that was not the case. So literally at the end of my road is the windmill where Robert Baden-Powell wrote Scouting, which is the second most widely published book in the English language, the first being the Bible. So that gives you a sense of the influence of that book. And I only discovered when I was researching my book, was inspired to create Scouting whilst he was on a colonial mission to destroy the kingdom of my heritage in Kumasi in Ghana, as part of the Project of Empire, to subjugate the Ashantis who didn't want to be Christianized, westernized, and subjugated, and have their gold expropriated by Britain to finance British development. And so Baden-Powell led this war to sack the Ashanti kingdom. And this is how empire worked. They knew that to do that, they needed to destroy the integrity, the symbols, the heritage, the literature, the libraries, the places of worship, the cultural heartlands of that tradition. And they needed to humiliate the king, deport him, and all these things. So Baden-Powell was a key figure in that military war. And on the way, he learned from his mercenaries all of these techniques that Africans used, that Ghanaians used, things like how to tie knots, how to make bridges, how to use a staff, things that actually became key tenets of Scouting. So as a Brownie myself, you can imagine how I felt to realize that part of my childhood had been spent, one, living in the site where this was kind of turned into a commercial activity without anything to mark it visibly, and two, that I'd actually been part of this movement that celebrated something that was born out of the destruction of my heritage. That's one example. Second example is that my school, while I was at it, built an amazing new sports hall and swimming pool called Draxmont. And it was actually only a few weeks ago that I discovered that that was land that was owned and financed by a very famous slave-owning family called the Draxes, who actually pioneered a form of plantation slavery in Barbados and other colonies. So these things were omnipresent. I mean, this is just me and the area I happen to live in. And there was nothing to indicate this history. You have to look really hard to find it. And it really made me appreciate how much this is around all of us in our towns, villages, cities. It's just been erased. And if one or two things get erased, you can put it down to the passage of time or the incompleteness of archives. When the entire 4 centuries long connection between Britain and the African continent, the enslavement of millions of Africans, the colonial project that allowed Britain to win 2 world wars and rebuild itself afterwards, when that's all totally rendered invisible, you start to see something very systematic and very deliberate at work. So reversing that in my own life was a really important first step to understanding the scale of this and how much we're still living with it. And it's so interesting to me that when you say this, it's described as provocative. It's always described as provocative. And it's so ironic because actually, as a British person, I had what I thought were a set of British values in my head. You know, we hear all this like very racially loaded nonsense from governments about British values. My British values, I would say, are an obsession with history. British people are obsessed with. We love period dramas. We love historic novels. We love national trust and stately homes, properties, and a belief in intellectual curiosity, a pride in academia. These are things that I would regard as British values. And it's very hard to square with any of those values, the idea that you turn history into a form of propaganda that only promotes an idea of Britishness as something that can be celebrated as a glorious history. That's more something I would expect from North Korea than a nation that regards itself as a modern democracy. Yet that's the level of our conversation about history. And the colonial, very recent colonial past. So I think that the level of fragility that's at work in Britain it's just profoundly troubling. If you care about Britain, if you care about our future, if you care about our ability to be resilient and compete on a global stage and attract people who have that intellectual curiosity, how can we compete with other nations that do that when we are functioning like a right-wing dictatorship in our narratives about our past and who we are now? It's really dark.
Afua, how do you stay so strong and so steady? Because unlike me, I go into fury. You never let that happen.
I do get angry. There's two answers to this. The official answer is that I used to be a barrister. I've been trained in adversarial situations. I've kind of been like professionalized into being able to conduct arguments even when you're presented with a really offensive or ludicrous case, and to be able to kind of like systematically unpick it. So that's the official answer, that I've kind of been trained to do that. The truth is that it is really difficult, and that I think there's a sense of guilt that I had, that in a way, I've had proximity to whiteness. In a way, I grew up with middle-class white people, so it's almost like my responsibility to talk to them, educate them, interact with them, counter these views that are proliferating. It's like a burden that I took upon myself to carry. And because I felt that, I don't think I actually gave myself space to acknowledge the cost to myself or the ways in which it affected me. And I have to say, the murder of George Floyd probably affected me differently to a lot of other people, because I spend so much time working on anti-racism and understanding how violent racism is. So it wasn't a shock in any way to me, but the reactions to George Floyd's murder made me give myself permission to acknowledge the impact that those spaces have had on me. And actually that, yes, it has taken a toll, and it has been incredibly draining and sometimes quite traumatic. And I just didn't give myself permission to acknowledge that before. So, and my response to that has been to actually just be more vocal about that, and to hope that it helps give other people permission to withdraw themselves from those spaces if they feel similarly, but also not to judge. And there are people who thrive on the adversarial nature of those spaces and actually enjoy kind of humiliating racists and racism. And I think they're amazing. I support them all the way. So I think everyone is different. And also, if you are anti-racist or you want to be part of the solution, everybody has their role to play. It's not necessarily the case that you need to go on TV and stay calm in a really provocative debate. It's not necessarily the case that you need to write angry columns, although I've done both of those things. I think that everyone has a role to play, and the point is to work out what you can do.
There's a very interesting message from Min Kaur, where she says, I faced a lot of racism and discrimination, and I too turned 40 last year. It's hard to move forward in an industry that doesn't give women of color the chance, and I have to feel that I must change who I am. How do you move forward if you don't feel you fit in?
I would say very strongly that there is so much pressure to assimilate, but you get rewarded for assimilating, in the sense that you get promoted, you might get honors and so forth, but you don't get rewarded in the sense that no one actually thanks you. If you become like everyone else, then you don't have anything to offer. You're not authentic to yourself. You're not bringing a different perspective. Diversity is what makes spaces, ideas, institutions, nations thrive. And I think that, I mean diversity in the broadest sense, people with different psychological makeups, different ages, genders, sexual orientations, races, cultural backgrounds. Diversity, it's been proven so many times, creates anti-fragility, resilience, better ideas, better decision-making. And so if you assimilate into the pre-existing culture, you are depriving yourself one of your authentic identity, but you're also just depriving the people who are encouraging you to assimilate into the benefit that you bring to them. Now, they often don't realize that and encourage you to assimilate. And so in a way, it's like you have to know what's better for them more than they know for themselves. And that obviously, when you take into account the power dynamics in workplaces, it's really difficult. If you're the only Black person, or you're in a position where you've got superiors and managers, bosses who want you to assimilate, it can be very hard to educate them.
That links to another question that was sent earlier, which is almost kind of the other side of the coin. Journalists of color who are expected to write or talk about race by media outlets. How do you, this is the question, how do we best mitigate the gaslighting and toxicity these discussions bring about? Is it worth doing?
Sorry, the gaslighting and toxicity that comes when you do write about race or when you
talk about race.
Yeah, I mean, that is a complicated question as well. You know, it's kind of like the burden of authenticity, because I've experienced this. You know, I became a professional journalist when I joined The Guardian in my 20s as the legal correspondent. My job was to write about litigation, the legal system, international law, war crimes, human rights, the Constitution. I ended up probably writing more columns, at least, about race and identity than anything else. And that wasn't because that's what I set out to do. It was because things happened that required a Black perspective. And I was there, and it was a case of, if I don't do it, who's going to do it? And also I wanted it to be done properly. And then you end up in this position where you're the Black person who writes about race. And especially for me as a legal correspondent, it was not what I intended to do. And it's a genuine dilemma, because I can do it and wanted it to be done properly and therefore did it. But at the same time, I didn't want to send a message that that's really the only thing we can do, you know. I
remember one editor I worked for, and this went on and on and on and on, forced marriages, arranged marriages. And one day I said to him, you know what? I love sex and I love food. And can I please write about sex and food this week?
Exactly.
I just couldn't bear it anymore.
It's really problematic, and you know, our industry is not subtle. So you know, someone will come up to you in the newsroom and be like, "Have you heard about this gang murder? Do you have any contacts we can use?" You know, it's just. I mean, it's
no, but the other thing you've probably said it, but is that how the transition from being a barrister to journalism happened, through this work, the work you were doing for The Guardian? Is that what led you into the right?
I was a practicing barrister, and I saw Guardian legal affairs correspondent advertised in The Guardian, and I thought that's my dream job. And I applied for it, even though it said it needed someone with 15 years newsroom experience, which I obviously didn't have. But I knew I could do it. And I believed that having deep knowledge and experience of the legal system, as well as contacts and kind of legitimacy within the legal community, would be a real asset. It did take some persuading, as well as 3 rounds of interview and written assignments at The Guardian to get the job. But I literally applied for it because I just had this vision that I could do this. So, and you know, I knew I loved journalism because of my experience at school, but it was very different, you know, interviewing fellow teenagers in the 90s as a schoolgirl to being a senior specialist correspondent at The Guardian in my late 20s. So that was really how the transition happened. It wasn't much of a transition. It was like, bam. And, you know, journalism being journalism, obviously there's no like induction, there's no grace period. You're just like, in fact, you know, when Max, I've just temporarily blanked his name, you know, Mosley died recently. Mosley. It reminded me that on my first day at work at The Guardian, I got a phone call from Max Mosley, which I was like, what the hell? Basically telling me that our privacy laws were a complete basket case and this was the worst abuse of human rights. And even though he liked having Nazi orgies with prostitutes, that was none of anyone's bit. So that was on my day one. It's like working out what to do with this incredibly irate son of a fascist Formula One leader who likes Nazi orgies, and how I was going to create balanced reporting about privacy laws and litigation and crazy people's private lives. So anyway, if there was no like gentle induction. So that was the transition really overnight.
Is there anybody who wants to ask Afua any questions? Anyone who wants to come in, or shall we just carry on? Anyone?
I think we've got one. Sorry, I accidentally turned my video off. I didn't want to distract from you both. We've got one that's just come in that says, do you have any advice that you'd give to Black journalists when it comes to their mental health, or any tips that have kind of worked for you, or just, yeah, any general advice?
Yes, I do have advice for Black journalists. A few practical things. So one of the things that's been so powerful for me, because I've never worked in a newsroom where there's anything like critical mass of people of color or Black people or Black women, was to create virtual networks. So and you know, spaces like this are really important. I had a WhatsApp group of Black journalists in totally different media organizations, dispersed across the country, in some cases across the world. We couldn't work in the same room, but we supported each other virtually. And it might sound trite, but it was a huge source of support. I could ask for advice and support in real time for things I was going through. We shared experiences, strategies, opportunities. It was really powerful. And I would say build a community of your people and use it. Be just strategic and intentional about it. It's not just like don't use it like a social thing. It's a real tool to coping, thriving. And it helps you also visualize how it should be. You should be surrounded by peers in real life. And the more that I think we work together, the more that we can help achieve that. I would say, you know, kind of carrying on from the earlier question, really focus on your authenticity. It's so hard when you feel your authenticity is under attack, you're under pressure to assimilate, you feel kind of penalized or demonized for being vocal or proud of your identity or your perspective. But my experience is that the best things that have happened to me in my career were when I was really unapologetic. And at the time, I made decisions that I thought would harm me. And I did them anyway because I believed in them. And I made those decisions through a process of integrity that I believed in. So I knew that I knew that I believed in what I was doing. And actually, they ended up benefiting me hugely. But the point is, you don't make the decision because it's going to benefit you. You make it because it's what is the right thing to do based on who you are and your values. So I think it's very important to conduct that process, because otherwise you can get lost. You can get lost in seeking other people's approval, in trying to assimilate, and then you're no use to anyone. You know, you're not being authentic to yourself, and you don't really have anything to add as a voice or perspective in the place that you're working anyway. And I know it's easy to say that, but I've literally been through it and supported so many other people who've been through it, and it always works out for you if you work out what your values are, what success is for you, and then you stick to it. You're authentic to that. That's really important.
And I would add that, you know, don't be afraid. It can be very intimidating. But actually, the people who do best are the people who are, as Afua said, authentic and willing to stay with it. Yeah. And join Women in Journalism. There are so many of us who are always happy to help and support you and mentor you, because it's such a lonely occupation. It can be such an isolating and lonely occupation that having somebody who cares about you and who's watching your back helps a lot.
And it can
I
be
nearly had a breakdown.
well. I've actually, one of the more distressing things I encountered was when there's like one other Black person and they feel really threatened by you and they really compete with you and they feel that you might expose them as the kind of the token Black person who's doing well. And that's really distressing because, you know, you can't even blame that person. They've kind of been made to feel that way by design. That's how racism works. But it's so toxic, and it's always, I find that much more traumatic than if a white person is being problematic. So sometimes it's actually better to have a support group outside your organization, because journalism is competitive. We're competitive people. People can feel threatened by other people's success. You know, when I was at The Guardian, there were maybe 4 or 5 of us, all kind of similar age, who were all seen as rising stars. And we were friends, but it was so competitive, and none of them were Black. We were and doing different things, but it was so competitive, and everybody was looking at everyone else. And if someone got a front page, everyone else was like, you know, someone got a photo byline, everyone else felt crap. It was, I mean, I would like to say I never bought into that, and I really reject that way of thinking and functioning, but it's quite, you know, it's a pervasive atmosphere in a lot of newsrooms, and there's a lot of ego. And I think it's good to reject that if you can, but also it's good to get perspective by having support outside the room sometimes.
And also, sometimes
sorry,
the best support comes from every step of the way. For my career, I've been helped by very middle class, often Oxbridge white men, who felt guilty or whatever they felt about whatever was happening in the office environment. When I joined the Indie, it was an all-white newspaper. And so just allies, and I still would go back to them when I'm having a bad time. I nearly had a breakdown last December because of the attacks I was getting. And the people I could turn to were some of the people, as Afua said, who had nurtured a relationship beyond the profession, if you like. And they really did step up and help. So, yeah. But
take
look,
allies
really,
in whatever form you have them. I would take allies in whatever form you find them, and really be intentional about working with them and benefiting from their support.
One final question, if I may, just because we've had two quick ones in the chat, if that's okay. Just any kind of practical advice you want to end on, just if people are struggling with racism in the workplace and people aren't getting it, or also kind of being asked to write things that they don't want to be pigeonholed and want to avoid any particular issues. Just if you had any bits of practical advice you might want to kind of leave us with, as there's quite a few people that have kind of mentioned that in the chat.
I would refer, like politically speaking within your organization, I would refer to external resources. So rather than, you know, responding to being asked to write something by saying, you know, that's racist or it's like racially pigeonholing you, I would maybe like recommend a book or an article or video that this person can watch where they can work out for themselves why it's problematic that they're asking you that. Because one thing that has changed is the availability and accessibility of resources that now educate people. And I would also, it's not your job to educate your colleagues about why they shouldn't be racist. It's not your job. Don't take it upon yourself. It's too draining. You're too invested in the relationship. Your position may be precarious. So just let go of any idea that you have to solve this problem. But if you can find strategic ways of getting other people to intervene or pointing that person or those people to external resources, I think that can be really helpful. And that's something that I've done and a lot of other people I know have done. So don't feel it's all your job to do.
Afua, thank you so much. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for being who you are. And onward, sister, and a happy birthday from all of us.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, Yasmin. Thank you for everything you do too. Bye.